Manipulators rarely attempt to control everyone they meet. They choose their targets carefully. The selection is quiet and methodical. If you have ever left a conversation feeling strangely disoriented while the other person remained calm and composed, then you have already experienced the beginning of psychological manipulation. It rarely appears loud or aggressive. It rarely looks like anger or obvious hostility. The most effective manipulators often appear reasonable. They sound thoughtful. They present themselves as calm problem solvers. They speak with logic and restraint while quietly using your conscience as the mechanism that restrains you. The frightening part is how slowly it happens. Manipulation rarely destroys someone in a single confrontation. Instead, it shifts your thinking gradually. One conversation leads to another. One subtle pressure becomes two. Over time, you begin questioning your memory, doubting your instincts, and apologizing for things you never intended to do. The entire structure begins with something simple: not control, permission. Manipulators study how people respond to discomfort. They observe how quickly someone explains themselves under pressure. They listen for guilt hidden in a person's tone. They look for the weakness that can be pulled, the desire for harmony, the fear of conflict, the need to appear good in the eyes of others. Once they discover the pressure point, they begin building an entire system around it, and they call it communication. Centuries ago, Machiavelli described this pattern clearly. Those who understand human weakness gain influence over those who do not. Not necessarily because they are more intelligent, but because they are willing to study what makes people bend. They learn where pressure produces submission. They learn how emotions can become tools. Understanding these patterns is not about becoming ruthless. It is about mental survival. Once you recognize the pattern, the illusion disappears. The first tactic begins with something that appears generous. Most people believe manipulation begins with deception. In reality, it often begins with kindness. Someone does you a favor. They offer help you never requested. They give support without any visible expectation. The gesture feels thoughtful. You feel grateful. That reaction is natural. But the manipulator is not giving freely. They are investing. This tactic creates what can be called an invisible contract. The help appears generous at first, but months later, the memory of that gesture becomes a tool. When the manipulator finally asks for something that violates your comfort or boundaries, the request does not feel like a request. It feels like a debt being collected. They rarely ask directly. Instead, they remind you of the past favor in casual language. They recall how they supported you when nobody else did. They bring up the sacrifice they made for your benefit. In that moment, your attention shifts away from the present request. Instead, you begin evaluating whether refusing them would make you appear ungrateful. The emotional trap is complete. You are no longer deciding whether their request is fair. You are defending your character. The conversation becomes about whether you are loyal, generous, appreciative. The manipulator has moved the entire discussion away from the original boundary. This tactic works because human beings are trained to value reciprocity. We believe kindness should be returned. Yet reciprocity is healthy only when both people give freely without keeping score. Manipulation transforms generosity into a transaction. Every favor becomes leverage. Breaking the invisible contract begins with recognizing that gratitude does not equal obligation. You can appreciate what someone did without surrendering your autonomy. A genuine act of kindness does not require repayment through submission. When someone reminds you of everything they have done for you, the response is simple and calm. Acknowledge the gesture. Then maintain your boundary. Appreciation does not erase your right to say no. Healthy individuals will understand this difference. They may feel disappointed, but they will accept the boundary because their original gesture was sincere. Manipulators react differently. They escalate. They express outrage. They accuse you of selfishness or betrayal. That reaction reveals their intention. Once you recognize the invisible contract, you begin seeing it everywhere. The relative who lists every sacrifice they made whenever you disagree with them. The friend who expects your loyalty only when it benefits them. The partner who performs acts of affection and later uses them as emotional currency. The pattern is identical. Kindness is not offered freely. It is planted as leverage. Machiavelli observed that people who place others in emotional debt gain influence without force. Guilt becomes the chain. The most effective prison is the one the prisoner closes around himself. Escaping that prison requires a simple realization. A gift with conditions was never a gift. It was an investment disguised as generosity. Once you stop accepting invisible contracts, manipulators lose one of their most reliable tools. The next tactic is even more subtle. Instead of creating guilt through favors, manipulators learn to weaponize your morality. Every person carries certain values they are proud of. Compassion, loyalty, forgiveness, fairness. These values define identity. Manipulators observe those values carefully, then they turn them against you. If you believe in forgiveness, they remind you that good people forgive mistakes. If loyalty matters to you, they question whether you truly stand by the people in your life. If you believe in giving others opportunities to grow, they frame their repeated mistakes as opportunities for you to prove your character. The request no longer appears selfish. Instead, it appears as a test of your identity. Now you are no longer deciding whether the situation is acceptable. You are deciding whether you are the kind of person you claim to be. The manipulator reframes accountability as cruelty. Holding them responsible suddenly appears inconsistent with your values. This tactic works because good people care deeply about living according to their principles. But forgiveness does not require unlimited access. Compassion does not require tolerance of repeated harm. Granting someone a chance to grow does not mean volunteering to endure endless consequences for their actions. A person can forgive someone and still remove them from their life. The difference between morality and manipulation lies in boundaries. True values protect both others and yourself. When someone demands your sacrifice in the name of your own principles, they are no longer respecting your morality. They are exploiting it. The answer is not abandoning your values. It is defining them clearly. Forgiveness can exist without trust. Compassion can exist alongside distance. Loyalty does not require blind obedience. When your values include self-respect, the manipulation loses power. Clarity destroys moral hijacking. And once someone realizes that your principles cannot be twisted against you, their strategy begins to collapse. Another tactic manipulators rely on has nothing to do with words themselves. It revolves around timing. They understand something many people overlook. Your ability to think clearly changes depending on your mental state. When you are calm, rested, and focused, you are difficult to influence. But when you are exhausted, rushed, or overwhelmed, your defenses weaken. Manipulators exploit this shift deliberately. Serious conversations rarely appear when you are fully prepared to engage. They arrive when your attention is divided. You might be rushing out the door for an important commitment when suddenly someone insists that a critical discussion must happen immediately. You might have just finished a long, exhausting day when an urgent emotional conversation suddenly appears. The timing is rarely accidental. This strategy can be called emotional time control. Instead of forcing you to accept a demand directly, the manipulator adjusts the moment when the demand appears. If the conversation occurs while you are mentally depleted, your resistance drops. Your mind seeks relief rather than accuracy. Under those conditions, you may agree to things you would normally reject. You may apologize simply to end the conflict. The desire to escape the pressure becomes stronger than the desire to defend your boundaries. Later, when the conversation ends and clarity returns, you realize something unsettling. You ask yourself why you agreed in the first place. The answer is simple. You were ambushed. Manipulators instinctively observe when your defenses are lowest. Late at night when fatigue weakens your focus, during public gatherings where you will avoid creating a scene, during moments when you are sick, distracted, or emotionally drained. They introduce serious topics precisely when your mind lacks the strength to challenge them properly. If you attempt to delay the discussion, the manipulator reframes your hesitation as avoidance. They accuse you of running away from responsibility. They insist that the issue must be resolved immediately. But genuine urgency rarely behaves this way. Real problems do not depend on ambushing someone when they are vulnerable. The most effective response is reclaiming control of time. When someone attempts to force a conversation during a moment that weakens your ability to respond clearly, acknowledge the topic without engaging immediately. State that the matter deserves proper attention and suggest a specific time to discuss it later. This simple shift restores balance. If the other person genuinely wants resolution, they will accept the delay. If their goal was to pressure you into quick submission, they will resist strongly. Their insistence on immediacy reveals their strategy. Machiavelli noted that control over timing often determines the outcome of conflict. The individual who chooses when the confrontation happens usually holds the advantage. When you refuse to fight on someone else's schedule, you disrupt the manipulation completely. Another technique manipulates not time but perception. This tactic is far more disorienting because it attacks your trust in your own mind. You remember a conversation clearly. The words, the tone, the context all remain vivid. Yet when you mention it, the other person responds with complete denial. They insist the conversation never occurred. They claim your interpretation is inaccurate. Suddenly, the discussion shifts. Instead of addressing their behavior, you begin defending your memory. This is weaponized confusion. The manipulator does not need to win the argument directly. They only need to create doubt about whether the argument exists at all. Once uncertainty enters your thinking, your ability to enforce boundaries weakens. They accomplish this by blending small truths with denial. Perhaps you misremembered a minor detail, such as the day or the exact wording. They seize that small inconsistency and present it as proof that your entire recollection is unreliable. One minor mistake becomes the foundation for dismantling your entire claim. Gradually, you begin questioning your own perception. Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe you reacted too strongly. Perhaps you are remembering events incorrectly. That moment of doubt is the manipulator's victory. Confused individuals hesitate. They avoid confrontation because they no longer trust their own judgment. They apologize simply to escape the tension. Understanding the difference between confusion and deliberate distortion is essential. Genuine misunderstandings happen occasionally. But when one person consistently leaves conversations feeling uncertain about their own memory, the pattern reveals intention. The most effective response avoids arguing over specific details. Manipulators thrive on debates about facts because those debates pull you deeper into their framework. Instead of arguing over every word that was spoken, focus on your experience. State clearly how the situation affected you and what boundary you are enforcing as a result. Your experience does not require their validation to exist. They may accuse you of calling them dishonest. They may attempt to pull you back into a debate about who is right. But refusing to argue over memory removes the foundation of their tactic. Documentation also restores clarity. Keeping records of conversations, messages, or patterns of behavior protects you from the fog manipulation creates. Evidence does not necessarily convince the manipulator. Their goal is rarely truth, but evidence reminds you that your perception remains intact. The purpose of documentation is not to prove something to them, it is to protect your trust in yourself. Machiavelli warned that the most dangerous adversary is the one who causes you to doubt your own judgment. Once that doubt appears, control shifts easily from you to them. Trusting your perception is therefore not arrogance, it is defense. Another manipulation method works through emotional withdrawal rather than argument. There is no shouting, no accusations. Instead, warmth disappears. The person remains physically present but emotionally distant. This tactic can be described as strategic emotional absence. You express a boundary or challenge unacceptable behavior. Instead of discussing the issue openly, the other person becomes cold. Their responses become brief. Their attention fades. The connection you once felt suddenly disappears. The silence carries a message. This is what happens when you resist. The brilliance of this tactic lies in its deniability. If you confront the distance directly, they can dismiss your observation. They claim everything is normal. They accuse you of imagining problems. Yet the shift remains obvious. Humans depend on connection. When someone important withdraws emotionally, anxiety appears quickly. Many people respond by attempting to repair the relationship immediately, even when they did nothing wrong. They soften their boundaries. They apologize unnecessarily. They attempt to restore warmth at any cost. Without realizing it, they train themselves to associate boundaries with abandonment. Manipulators rely on this pattern. They understand that if the emotional price of enforcing a boundary becomes high enough, most people will stop enforcing it altogether. The most powerful response is calm non-reaction. When someone withdraws warmth intentionally, allow the distance to remain. Do not chase it. Do not negotiate with it. Continue behaving normally without attempting to repair a conflict that was never yours. Strategic emotional absence only functions when the target becomes anxious enough to pursue the connection again. If you remain steady, the tactic collapses. One of two outcomes appears. Either the manipulator restores warmth because the strategy failed, or the emotional distance continues. If the distance continues, it reveals a truth that might otherwise remain hidden. The relationship depended on your compliance. Machiavelli observed that those who tolerate silence hold more power than those who fear it. Silence becomes threatening only when someone believes they cannot endure it. When you can remain calm within that quiet space, manipulation loses its leverage. Once you begin recognizing these patterns, the final challenge appears. Seeing manipulation is only the first step. The real difficulty is leaving the dynamic without creating a situation that gives the manipulator more control. Many people imagine that the solution is confrontation. They believe exposing the manipulation directly will force accountability. They imagine presenting evidence, explaining the pattern clearly, and finally watching the manipulator admit what they did. Reality rarely unfolds that way. Manipulators rarely accept responsibility. When confronted directly, they shift into defense immediately. They deny what happened, redirect blame, or portray themselves as victims of misunderstanding. The conversation becomes chaotic and emotional. Eventually, the focus moves away from their behavior and toward your reaction. This is why the most effective solution is rarely exposure. It is exit. A quiet exit does not mean disappearing without explanation or creating drama. It means reducing your involvement carefully while refusing to participate in the cycle of reaction the manipulator depends on. Manipulators feed on emotional engagement. They require your frustration, your anger, and your attempts to defend yourself. Those reactions provide the material to reshape the story. When you react strongly, they can portray you as unstable. When you defend yourself passionately, they frame you as overly sensitive. They hide the original cause of the conflict and present your emotional response as the real problem. The trap closes when you attempt to prove your innocence. A strategic exit denies them that opportunity. Instead of presenting a long explanation detailing every manipulation you experienced, you reduce your participation quietly. You limit contact. You shift your attention toward other priorities. When asked why your distance has increased, the answer remains simple and calm. You are focusing on yourself. You are reevaluating certain areas of your life. You feel the relationship no longer fits where you are going. The explanation ends there. Many people struggle with this approach because they feel honesty requires a full disclosure of every grievance. In healthy relationships, that instinct can be useful. But with manipulators, it becomes ammunition. Every example you provide becomes something they dissect, deny, or reinterpret. Hours pass while the discussion circles endlessly. Eventually, you become exhausted while they remain energized by the conflict. By refusing to debate the past, you remove their battlefield entirely. This strategy also protects your credibility. When someone attempts to provoke you into defending yourself publicly, remaining calm prevents them from reshaping your reaction into a narrative about instability. They may still speak about you. They may present their own version of events. Allow them to. People who rely on manipulation often reveal themselves eventually through patterns of behavior. You do not need to expose them. Time does that work naturally. The individuals who observe quietly will recognize the pattern. Your responsibility is simply to protect your peace. In situations where complete separation is impossible, the same principle applies in a different form. Family connections, professional environments, and shared responsibilities sometimes require continued contact. In those cases, the exit becomes emotional rather than physical. You remain civil, you remain polite, but you stop offering personal access. Your conversations become neutral. You avoid sharing vulnerabilities, ambitions, or frustrations. Information that once flowed freely now becomes limited. The manipulator receives nothing to use as leverage. This approach is sometimes described as becoming emotionally uninteresting. Not hostile, not confrontational, simply neutral. Without emotional reactions, the manipulator loses the feedback they rely on. Their attempts to provoke anger or guilt produce no visible response. Conversations become dull and predictable. Eventually, the lack of emotional return makes the dynamic unappealing. Manipulators often seek new targets who provide the reaction they need. Remaining quiet also preserves dignity. It prevents you from being drawn into public disputes where truth becomes difficult to establish. People who observe from a distance often trust the individual who maintains composure over the one who constantly stirs conflict. Credibility grows through restraint. Another important discipline during this stage is avoiding the temptation to recruit allies. After experiencing manipulation, many people feel an understandable urge to tell everyone what happened. They want validation. They want witnesses who confirm their interpretation. But involving others often complicates the situation further. Manipulators thrive in environments where narratives compete. They can twist each retelling into another example of you exaggerating or spreading drama. Remaining quiet denies them that advantage. Those who experience similar behavior from the same person will eventually recognize it on their own. Machiavelli observed that the individual who remains calm while others argue often holds the real control of the situation. Emotional restraint keeps the focus on actions rather than reactions. Silence becomes strategy. Manipulation rarely announces itself openly. It enters quietly disguised as concern, logic, or helpful advice. Its strength depends on confusion and emotional fog. The moment clarity appears, its structure begins to collapse. Knowledge alone does not end manipulation. Action does. Sometimes that action is as simple as refusing to respond to guilt. Sometimes it is delaying a conversation until you can think clearly. Sometimes it is allowing someone's emotional distance to remain without chasing them. Each small decision restores control over your own mind. Manipulators rely on patterns repeating endlessly. The moment you interrupt those patterns, the structure weakens. This does not require confrontation or hostility. Often the most effective response is simply stepping outside the dynamic entirely. Distance removes the stage on which manipulation performs. Over time, the absence of reaction transforms everything. Conversations become shorter. Emotional pressure fades. The manipulator eventually recognizes that their tactics no longer produce results. At that point, they must either change their behavior or search for influence elsewhere. Either outcome restores your independence. Machiavelli warned that those who understand human weakness gain influence over those who do not. But the reverse is equally true. The moment you understand the pattern, you remove the advantage completely. Manipulation survives only when the target remains uncertain. Clarity ends the game, and once you learn to see these strategies clearly, the fog disappears. The conversations that once left you confused begin to make sense. The pressure that once felt overwhelming becomes predictable. From that moment forward, the manipulator loses the one thing they depended on most: your participation.